Okay, guys, this is chapter 1, from prehistory to early civilizations. These are the key terms and topics for chapter 1. Even though there's 2 voice threads for chapter 1, there won't be another set of key terms. Make sure you can define these and tell their importance. I would get a separate sheet of paper, notebook, whatever, and define them as I was reading the chapter. As I was saying, the chapter is broken up into 2 parts. You have the first part, which is going to deal with hunters and gatherers and early man, and then the second part, which is going to deal with early river valley civilizations. Make sure to expand some of the slides every now and then by clicking on the X in the corner or using the magnifying glass. That way you can see that we're looking at the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Indus, and the Chinese along the Yellow River. Realize as we get started with this chapter that a lot of this is conjecture. A lot of this is what scholars think. It's an hypothesis. It's pretty sure it happened this way. All right, it's not going to be exact fact though. All right, so human life in the era of hunters and gatherers. The Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years old. You can see there in the image the different periods it's gone through. What you need to realize is that the time frame of the Earth versus the time frame of like humanity is drastically different. We look at this as in terms of geological time. So if the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years and humanity evolved somewhere, or human-like creatures came around somewhere 2.5 million years ago, we're a blip in the existence of the Earth, right? 1/4000th the time that Earth has been existed, we've been on it, right? If you took the time that the planet has been around and you put it in the context of a 24-hour day, your textbook says that humanity's been around for 5 minutes of that 24-hour day. There's other places it'll say it was like 1 minute and 17 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever. What you need to realize is that the time that you spend passing between class in the context of the Earth being around for 24 hours, we would be around less than that. Even though we see ourselves probably as the top of the food chains, there are some drawbacks to being human compared to say other animals. Even in the picture down there, you got the little dinosaur, right? There's a lot of things about the dinosaur that would have been probably beneficial compared to say being a human. First of all, let's think about us as children. We're basically useless to some extent. We need our parents to take care of us. Most animals mature at a faster rate, so they're not a burden on their species, right? So they don't have to give up as much, because usually babies die fast, the species dies. Eventually, also think about the fact that since we're not like animals that walk on all fours, we stand upright. We actually, the way our bodies are structured, put us at a disadvantage. We can't run as fast as say a four-legged animal. Also, by standing upright, our bodies are designed in a way that it keeps our sort of vital organs exposed to in some extent to predators, where say a horse or a dog or whatever, most of their vital organs are going to be harder to get at because they'll be on the underside of them. And then lastly, sort of in a philosophical state, the idea of our sort of intellect, we struggle with the fact that we understand the inevitability that we're going to die. No other species on the planet has demonstrated that. Late Paleolithic developments. The Paleolithic period, or the Old Stone Age, lasted from about 2 million BCE to about 14,000 BCE. It's often characterized by the early use of tools and the types of tools they would have used. Also during this time period, as we said, how there were like 2.5 million years ago when people came into being, that there would have been maybe different varieties of people. You might have heard of things such as Neanderthals. Neanderthals would look like people to an extent. They'd be hairier, more stocky, sturdier build, larger brow, that kind of stuff. and probably not as intellectually with it as, say, the eventual Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were discovered in Germany. That's where they get their name. And they actually, there's some different theories on what happened. Oftentimes, most people assume they were either killed off or intermingled with the emerging human-like Homo sapiens. They're not exactly sure. During this time period, people organized themselves into small bands, probably around 20 to 30 people. They would then hunt and gather to sustain themselves. As it says right there on the slide, they would spend 7 hours a day, roughly every 3 days, hunting game, deer, antelope, maybe larger game like mastodons, that sort of stuff. And also, they would gather fruits, nuts, berries, that sort of thing. That was generally the job of women, and oftentimes women are considered to be like the first agriculturalists because they would have been the ones noticing, oh, these seeds, when planted, grow this stuff that we're always collecting and eating. Now, these groups never grew very large because they could never actually sustain larger numbers. And we'll actually read a reading in class about this same sort of thing. Now, another thing that personified this time period was the use of stone tools. We'll look at yet again this in class as well. These stone tools would have been made from chips of stone like flint or something like that, right? And we'll talk about how the change in tools from the late Paleolithic to the Neolithic is one of the changes that shows us that man was kind of developing, all right? In 750,000 BCE, they obtained fire, but more importantly, in 100,000, they developed speech. And with the development of speech, especially when it comes to, say, hunting bands, you can now define the world around you. In defining the world around you, you can now give orders. You can then become more and more efficient in your hunting. All right. As your textbook will bring about in this part during the late Paleolithic era, the major, most large development is the sheer spread of the species, and you can see that here in the picture. All right. The interesting thing, as we know, man started off in Africa and began to spread all over. The last two places being populated, Australia and the southern tip of South America. All right, the Neolithic Revolution, all right, or the New Stone Age, between 8,000 and 5,000 BCE. This time period is going to be characterized by basically like man becoming more sedentary, settling down basically due to a group of factors, namely better tools, agriculture, domestication of animals, all the stuff it says listed right there. Better tools is a good place to start. As you look there on the right-hand side, you'll see the axe. Early man during the Paleolithic era used chipped stone tools, right? So he would get a rock, he'd break off the edge, he would then have a knife. Once that knife began dull, he would then throw it on the ground and get another rock and break off an edge, and now he had another knife. So they were basically disposable tools, right? That axe signifies a change, right? The change is that axe is reusable. He could get a stone and begin to sharpen the axe, right? And then use the axe again. Also, thanks to stuff like agriculture, farming, all that sort of stuff, he would now be more sedentary. He wouldn't move as much, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But once he became more sedentary, he could then store his axe. He didn't have to carry it everywhere with him. Also, the development of agriculture is going to be a key thing for the Neolithic Revolution, right? Early man had struggled to feed everybody, right, with being a hunter and gatherer. So now, becoming a farmer, you could support more people. All right, your textbook will talk about the way this comes about a little bit, but just think about this. Even though you worked very hard at becoming a farmer, an agriculturalist, or whatever, there was a bigger payoff. All right, and also over time, it talks about domestication of plants and animals. You could sort of genetically pick crops that provided larger payouts. So if you only picked those and you reseeded with those seeds, you know, the plants would then evolve to be the, you know, hardy breed. It's kind of like the picture of the wheat there. That wheat wouldn't have just naturally grown. They would have had to selectively pick the stalks that were healthier for that environment and then reseeded those. All right, and we'll look at agriculture a bit as we go forward. Also, the domestication of animals is incredibly important. They think that, you know, early man probably hunted animals close, not to extinction, but around him they would have started to sort of die off. And so eventually he got the bright idea to go and corral a few and keep them. And as he kept them, he would feed them. They would most likely cease being, you know, angry to them, and they would be angry towards him, and they would be domesticated. Now, domesticated animals provide a series of things that are good. You can use their hair or their wool, or however you want to think of that. You can use their milk. You can use their labor, most importantly, I would say. And you can also use their meat. All right. So they provide you with numerous things. Now, what this does is this brings us into a conflict which will sort of rage on for the early part of civilization. You have farmers who are going to be sedentary versus herders or pastoralists that are going to be nomadic, all right? And they're going to have different outlooks. And the, you know, it talks about in your textbook about it. I wonder with the debate about, you know, to decide to settle down and become a farmer versus being a herder or whatever. But that's what the stage is going to be set for with the development of these two groups. Now, why did all this happen? What changed? A big thing that scholars think is that the end of the Ice Age, a change in climate, was really one of the big catalysts. Right? Realize that, you know, a third of the Earth was covered with ice. That ice helped man, you know, move and, you know, migrate to places like across the Bering Strait into the Americas and so forth, following game. But that warming that occurred, they think, caused for higher productive yields of agriculture, crops that maybe were ripe twice a year. So that caused more people, right? You had more people, you needed more food. We need farmers. More people became farmers, or the advent of the good things of herding, that kind of thing. Also, the retreat of big game. Realize that they think that early man probably hunted, you know, woolly mammoths, mastodons, big, large animals that they could feed off of for a longer time. So if those larger animals are no longer around and they're having to hunt smaller animals, yet again the payoff wouldn't be as big. So yet again, sedentary, domesticating animals so they don't have to hunt them as regularly. Also farming. Geography of early agriculture. Make sure to read the section on this because I'm going to leave a little bit of it out. But this is kind of one of the interesting things because it sets the stage for when we get to like the 1500s and globalization and why some parts of the world are different. But you can see that you have different sort of agricultural centers here. You have Mesopotamia with its grain that's spread through Europe and down into Africa and into India. And then over here in China, you have rice, which is going to spread yet again across Asia, down into India and down into Indonesia and all that sort of stuff. In Mesoamerica, present-day Mexico, you had maize, which spread down into South America and up into North America. Places in, as it says right here in Africa, you had sorghum, which was also spread. And these were different types of foodstuff that could be grown, namely, you know, like say the rice twice a year. They were a cereal crop that could be stored, and they helped supply these larger populations. So why does this stuff change? Well, with the spread of those crops, realize that it became a popular thing, right? It was trendy, I guess would be a good term to think about it, right? If I could grow more food and support more people, right, and it wasn't overwhelmingly difficult, right? That's the thing you need to understand. It became adopted by more and more groups. Now, I say difficult, I don't mean difficult like it wasn't hard work. I mean difficult like it wasn't hard for them to understand and figure out how to do it. So as it said, farming could support more people. Thus, with more people, people started to settle down and form communities in certain areas. Now, yet again, as I was mentioning, this is the question, well, why do we settle down from being hunters and gatherers and now become farmers. There was going to be some blowback there. One of the big things that people think was disease. As it says in your book, disease played a role. Settled agricultural societies suffered from more contagious diseases because of a denser population. And what happened is they began to develop immunities, right? So hunters and gatherers and nomadic people didn't have resistances, all right? So as it says, often they died, and when agriculturalists who had developed immunity to these diseases carried on into their areas, all right? The idea would be they took over their stuff, right? But what you need to understand is they really think that the proximity with which people live with their animals and or each other, the people that are going to die from disease die. They then, other people procreate and have sort of disease-resistant kids, right? This will play a big role when we see the sort of Columbian interaction or Columbian exchange, whatever you want to call it, when Europe comes into contact with the New World, right? And so keep disease in the back of your head, keep the ideas of different types of foodstuffs in the back of your head, and the idea that different types of animals in the back of your head, because it's going to play a large role. Now, you're also going to see a technological change, right? As I mentioned before, agriculture, more food is going to lead to specialization, right? When you have an abundance of food, people don't have to scrounge, okay? People don't have to worry about feeding themselves. You have more than enough, so now people can worry about other things. So as long as you have people farming and keeping up the food supply, you can then have people specialize and make things like, say, pottery or baskets, right? The idea would be there's a problem. We need to keep our grain dry because it's something they could store for when they needed it. So somebody develops, pottery to store the grain, right? If you go back a few slides, there's a picture of a house. So that would have been something from this time period where they would have stored grain for when they needed it. They would have put it in pots, kept it up high, kept it away from moisture, and so they could use it, right? They think maybe that pottery and whitewash and all that sort of stuff would have led to eventually the discovery of bronze. Bronze is a ratio of copper and tin, or an alloy, as they call it, combination of two metals. Bronze was discovered or invented or created or whatever you want to call it in Anatolia, right, way back in 3000 BC. What they would have done is they would have found rocks that had big chunks of these metals in them, and they would have heated them up over a fire, right? Probably with an early form of bellows to get it real hot to turn them into liquid. They would have mixed, and then when they cooled, you would have had bronze. Now, bronze is a sturdier metal, or sturdier or stronger, I guess, than, say, stone, right? Stone would have been strong, but not as strong as bronze. Or if you did have a stone that was as strong as bronze, it would have weighed a lot, right? So bronze provided you strength, yet being very, very light. So this early alloy would have been used for tools, like, say, plows, or it would be used for armor or weapons, right? It would have been the sort of cutting-edge technology of its day, right? In it being the cutting-edge technology of its day, that doesn't mean that people still didn't use stone tools, right? The example I like to use is, even though we have cool things such as smartphones, they didn't catch on right away, right? People still used flip phones and other things because they were cheaper and more readily available. Well, the same thing's going to happen here. Bronze is going to come about and be the sort of hallmark of the age, but stone tools were still going to be in use because they were cheap and available. This brings us to an end of part 1 of chapter 1. So make sure eventually you watch part 2 whenever it gets assigned, and be prepared for readings/quizzes in class.